I'm David Corn.
And I'm Jim Pinkerton.
Good to see you again, Jim. We've had some very successful Blogging Ahead shows. In fact, we got 2 emails saying that you and I have something akin to chemistry. And that's the glorious founders that Robert Wright and Mickey Kaus, believed that we should do this yet again.
So 2 emails is a decisive vote from the audience, huh?
Well, according to Cora Rove, if there had been a turnabout of 4,000 votes in the last election, Republicans would be running the show or something like that. You know, our tipping points are very small here. But also, other Blogging Head news, there was a story that I saw a day or 2 ago. I think it was in the New York Sun. And I think you'll get a big kick out of this because I know you are quite the space maven. And it said that on Blogging Head, the people look as if they're astronauts talking back to the Earth. And since you and I always wanted to be astronauts, this is probably as close as we're going to get. I did watch Apollo 13 again recently, and
ground control to Major David. Okay, gotcha.
Okay, so I think the story to start with is the obvious story. And one motto at Blogging Head is, if we can't do the obvious, what good are we? And that is the elections. A week later, fallout. What do they mean? If they mean anything, where do we go? I know you have a whole riff on Reagan Democrats, but before we get to that, give me a sense of what you see in terms of the Republican reaction and conservative reaction in Washington from the White House on down to what happened a week ago.
Okay, well, I think that actually, you know, the White House reaction has been sort of what political scientists would tell you that it should be, which is they've made changes. I think, you know, as President Bush said, the Republicans took a thumping in the election, and he responded by firing Don Rumsfeld, and he's clearly going to have some interaction, not happily, but nonetheless he's going to do it with the Baker-Hamilton Commission. I mean, you're much more wired into what they're up to than I am.
And we'll talk about that.
Okay, we'll talk about that. But I think that in other words, for the time being, though, political science, American history tells you that when you get in trouble, you move toward bipartisanship. You appeal to the national interest. You say to your enemies in the political arena, look, you know, we don't like each other. We fought a battle against each other, but the country comes first. And so I was sort of heartened to see that Senator Levin, who's the incoming chairman, Democratic chairman of the Armed Services Committee, seemed to say, if I read him right, that he would be happy enough to see Robert Gates, the choice to replace Rumsfeld, get confirmed by the Republican Senate in the 109th in the lame duck session of the 109th Congress, as opposed to stretching it out ad infinitum into 2007, because I think the country needs a better defense secretary, to put it mildly, than Don Rumsfeld.
I think the country needs any defense secretary than Donald Rumsfeld, and I think Carl Levin's position probably was, gosh, this isn't rummy. It's a step up. Let's move ahead.
Well, that's right. That's what the country wants. The country is anxious to see some kind of satisfactory resolution, if it's possible. And I think both parties are sort of, at the risk of sounding sappy, have sort of seemed to express that.
And you know, columnists such as you and I are never any more happy than when we can try to be somewhat contrarian and surprise people. And I wrote a column last week when Rumsfeld was dumped and Gates replaced him, and which said, "Hooray for Gates." There was a question mark at the end, but I did try to make the case that the Gates nomination might actually lead to a good end here, and at least progress. And that comes from someone who covered Gates' nomination to be CIA director, and who was very critical of him because of all the charges that were leveled at him back in those days in 1991, that he had skewered and pressured intelligence analysts and had been, of course, wrong on the Soviet Union by failing to recognize quickly enough that that was a country undergoing dramatic change. But I'm willing to put that all aside, essentially because he's not Rumsfeld, and because he's on the Baker Commission, which we keep promising we will be talking about later. So it was somewhat of a surprising move in that it was a move in the right direction, which is the first time I think we can say this in a number of years when it comes to the Bush administration and Iraq. If I can continue for a second in terms of this bipartisan theme that you raised, if I have your permission to do so, what I've been struck by, and people on the right might just see this as spin, is that I remember back in 1994 when the Republicans took control of Congress and Newt Gingrich led the way. There was a real triumphalism in which they were basically saying, we don't need you, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, you're irrelevant. We don't need you, Democrats. They changed a lot of the rules to actually make the minority party even more irrelevant than it had been previously. And we're just going to do things our way. At least in tone, maybe this is just political positioning on the part of Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid. I don't see them doing that, and I think what's wise, at least on Nancy Pelosi's part, is that she has announced what she wants to enact initially when she takes over in January, and these are all programs and legislation that appeal to the liberal base of the Democratic Party, but also I think have wide public appeal. Raising the minimum wage, lowering interest rates on student loans, allowing the federal government to negotiate with drug companies to lower drug costs for the elderly, a package of lobbying reforms. I don't think they go far enough, but they go farther than anything that the Republicans were able to enact. And I think this is very smart on her part to sort of come out of the box, try to pass 5 or 6 things immediately to show that they're not a do-nothing Congress, and that these are things that the public at least won't be angry about, and many will actually be cheering.
I agree with you completely, and I mean that's exactly right. That's exactly sort of the kind of in the public's mind the kind of constructive working together that the people voted for or people want to see. However, and I'm extremely interested in your opinion on this. Having said all that, what does one make then of Nancy Pelosi seeming to pick a fight inside her own Democratic caucus over the issue of who's going to be the majority leader? Steny Hoyer's had the job for the last, 4 years now. Seems to have it locked up. And John Murtha, who admittedly is a late-blooming star in Democratic circles, I think is sort of a difficult long-shot chance. He's 73 years old and not recognized as a master legislator. And so for Pelosi to endorse him, to me, sort of to violate a lot of those arguments you were making. And then second of all, I was frankly surprised that the Democrats would, Pelosi, Reid, and several others all be saying, we're going to try and force a withdrawal from Iraq in beginning in 4 to 6 months. I was a little surprised to see them get that specific in advance of the Baker-Hamilton Commission findings, because it seems to suggest they've already made up their mind.
Yes, which we'll be talking about later. Good points, and funny you should ask about the Pelosi-Murtha matter, because I wrote a column about that yesterday in which I said I thought she should have ducked that fight. I'll explain why in a moment. One of the problems with Jack Murtha is that he has been accused of ethical violations. If you go to the this crew, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a watchdog group that's run by former Democrats, but they put out their list of the 20 most corrupt members of the House. There are a few Democrats on it, mostly Republicans. Then again, mostly Republicans are in power now. But in their 5 dishonorable mentions, they included Jack Murtha, and they cited a lot of earmarking going on in the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee that he's the ranking member of, in which I think it was his firm that his brother runs. The contractors who hire that firm end up getting a lot of earmarked contracts, tens of millions of dollars. And, of course, Nancy Pelosi has made the culture of corruption and severing the connection between legislation and lobbyists, a paramount issue for her and part of her first 100-day program. And if you look at the front page of the Washington Post today, you'll see right there, now because she came out and endorsed Jack Murtha, there's a whole issue about how she can present this part of her agenda while backing a fellow who has had ethical run-ins. He also, if you go back 20 years, he also was involved to some degree in the Abscan scandal, though never indicted and never sanctioned by the Ethics Committee. And I think it's a very good question. It's a fight that she could have stayed out of had she chosen to. There is obviously bad blood previously between her and Steny Hoyer. They've been rivals all along. Jack Murtha managed her campaign to be minority leader a few years back, and she and he have obviously bonded over the war. She might have figured that with the war being obviously the big issue down the pike here, that she wanted to have him next to her all the way, being a hawk, conservative. He gives a lot of cover to the critics of the war within the Democratic Party. But he is otherwise a very conservative member. He's voted with Republicans more than almost every other Democrat in the caucus. And as I said, raises ethical issues. I mean, Steny Hoyer does in a certain extent that he represents the institutional corruption of Washington when you raise a lot of money from lobbyists and then you listen to them when their bills are up before the House. But John Murtha has gotten into it in a very specific way with his earmarking. So I found this, a somewhat troubling decision on her part, and right away, she's off to a less, to a more rocky start than she had to, and maybe she had a loyalty to Jack Murtha that she felt she had to make good on, but also the vote I believe is on Thursday, and if Murtha loses, then she'll have a double curse. She would have backed a guy with ethics issues, and she would have backed a loser, showing that she's not such a strong leader. So now she has a lot vested in this fight between two guys, each carrying a load of baggage.
I agree. But the other point I mentioned was the seeming to prejudge the Baker-Hamilton Commission, which, again, I find that a little surprising. Yeah,
I mean, you had Carl Levin, too, coming out and saying that he wants to work with the Baker Commission, whatever they produce, but he also wants to, start a phased redeployment of troops, starting the redeployment within 4 to 6 months. Now, these could be, I think, fine on a policy level, but given that Baker is about to come out with a set of recommendations, in some ways, I think it would have been, politically wise to, see what cover that report may or may not provide to Democrats, not just Democrats, but to anybody who's looking for a way out of the war. This is increasingly not a D versus R issue, and the Baker Commission, would be a starting point for anybody who at least wants a change in the present course, because that's the one thing the Baker Commission is going to have to do. It's going to have to come up with proposals saying that what's happening there now is not working. Here's either one proposal we all agree on, or here are 2 or 3 different options that we all agree on to some degree, but here are the risks and benefits to each one. And that at least opens the door then for other people to accept those or to bring their own ideas to the table. But I guess perhaps in some ways, Pelosi and Carl Levin, who will be heading the Armed Services Committee of the Senate in January, are laying down their markers and, trying to define the debate as one between some form of redeployment, and if Baker and others want to come in with a different idea, that will be the debate, not whatever Bush proposes to do at the end of the day.
Well, that makes sense. The only danger is that again, down the road somewhere, somebody's going to, I think we talked about this last time, somebody's going to get tagged with who lost Iraq. And I think whichever party suffers that tag will pay a huge price, not only in 2008, but beyond that.
Well, this is on election night. I had some senior Democrats telling me they weren't sure they wanted to win the Senate. I mean, if they had not won the Senate, they would have been the insurgents fighting against the do-nothing Republicans of the Senate and the, denying reality Republicans in the White House. Now they become 50-50 partners in governing. Governing these days means cleaning up the mess in Iraq. And in some ways, Bush, if the Baker Commission or the Democrats in Senate force, a change in plan upon Bush, he will forever be able to say, we were 6 months from winning until, this other thing happened. And it will, it gives him an escape clause. Because he will not be left to his own devices in Iraq. So we will continue. I think we will have for a long time if we get out of Iraq in some way or another. Like the who lost China debate, the who lost Iraq debate, and it may be that whoever comes in with a responsible substitute policy for Bush. And I believe there is no easy answer. I believe there's no solution. I believe that whether you stay in or whether you leave, it's going to be a mess, maybe bordering on a disaster. And thus, anybody who sort of tries to change course will do so with an ugly set of consequences that may be unavoidable. But it will allow Bush and anyone who wants to support him to always say down the road, see what happened once you change course. And that is a dilemma that James Baker and the Congressional Democrats and Republicans, who I think increasingly will be calling for a different course in Iraq, are going to have to bear.
I agree, which gives us a great opportunity to speculate on or talk about how it is the Democrats came to win the Senate back. And I think, as it happens, the race that tipped the Democrats over into victory on November 7th was, of course, in Virginia with James Webb, who I think of as the most interesting figure to emerge from this election season.
Well, go ahead. I know you have a theory.
Well, yeah, my theory is, even before I knew that who was going to win the election on Tuesday, I wrote a column that appeared on Tuesday the 7th in which I said, look, the victor in this election is going to be the Reagan Democrats, the kind of somewhat center-right on social issues, somewhat center-left on economic issues, swing voters who were solidly Democratic before 1968 and have been mostly Republican with a few deviations for Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or Ross Perot since 1968. And I said these people will win the election in 2006 because they always win the election, because they're always decisive, because it is that the nature of a swing voter is to be decisive. And I mean, James Webb, who was a Republican until I think 3 years ago, and broke with the Republicans and Bush and Allen personally over the Iraq War, I think speaks to the kind of ticket-splitting enthusiasm that these people have. And I think some of the election results to support the argument that these people are how important they are. I was noticing in Wyoming, for example, Senator Thomas, who's a conservative Republican, was reelected with 70% of the vote, whereas Governor Freudenthal, who's a sort of a conservative Democrat, was also reelected with 70% of the vote. So you have two people winning with 70% of the vote in opposite parties. That's serious ticket splitting.
That's true. I think there are a lot of interesting and even some ways cross-cutting dynamics in this election, and you're not making this mistake, but some have made the mistake that the Democrats won because they became more conservative. Depends on what the meaning of what the meaning of conservative is. While Webb is more conservative on gun control, he and some of the other Democrats who won, talked about the problems with free trade accords and took a more populist line, as did Sherrod Brown in Ohio. While it's clear that that sort of the social liberalism of the past that we think about in terms of abortion and gay rights and gun control wasn't, I think, a propelling force to move swing voters towards the Democratic side. I think some candidates neutralized the gay rights issue, as did Claire McCaskill in Missouri, and she and other Democrats, went back to sort of the bread and butter issues of the Democratic Party, which obviously has some appeal to Reagan Democrats, the working class Americans, and that's where if the Democrats have any claim on people in the South, those are the issues that are going to work for them. So it's that type of economic populism, and perhaps not going overboard on the social liberalism that I think put some of these Democrats in a position to win. But we do have to say this about Virginia. Virginia gets an asterisk because it's quite clear to me, and you tell me if you see it differently, that if it wasn't for George Allen saying the word macaca, it wasn't for the existence, God bless us, of the internet and YouTube, he would be the returning senator from Virginia.
I I agree with that.
Obviously,
he
it was a
ran
stupid mistake. That one mistake, was the decisive turning point. He could have overcome everything else. The war, any economic populism from Jim Webb, whatever was out there, and it was the fact that not only that he said it, it was captured on video, and it didn't just air on local TV. It went across the internet, thanks to the wonders of YouTube, which even I use now on my own website. So anytime Republicans, conservatives look at the U.S. Senate, I guess starting in January, and they see the Democrats doing something they don't like, they should say to themselves, "Oh, macaca."
But I would say, though, I agree with everything you said. However, if the Democrats had run some generic Democrat against Allen, like, for example, the original candidate for the Virginia Democratic Party was a guy named Miller, just some lobbyist here in town. If they run him, and Allen had run the exact same campaign, including macaca, including YouTube, Allen probably would have won. I mean, in other words, you can argue the other way, too, which is that only Webb gave the Democrats the strength to overcome the basic Republican advantage in Virginia. But I do agree, and I think this is important for the Blogging Heads audience to make sure that we get a chance to articulate what I think we're kind of agree on here, which is if you look at some of the ballot referendums this year. David, you mentioned the gay marriage. It won, I think, everywhere but Arizona, which means it's won 27 of 28 states now, the anti-gay marriage referendum. The minimum wage, which is certainly an economic populist issue, was 6 for 6, victorious this year. But on sort of social issues, medical marijuana was voted down in Colorado and Nevada. And if you lose a medical marijuana initiative in Nevada, you're going to lose it anywhere.
You can pay for sex there, but you can't use marijuana.
Right. I mean, go figure. But and including a place in Michigan, for example. And again, this is the Democrats who were smart about this kind of stuff and didn't get in the way too much. Michigan overwhelmingly voted down and voted against affirmative action, and yet Governor Granholm and Senator Stabenow, both Democrats, were reelected. So, and in South Dakota. The voters, showing a kind of nuance, rejected a totalistic ban on abortion, and yet voted to re-elect by almost a 2-to-1 margin the Republican governor who signed it.
Yes.
So, in other words, I think they just showed, well, the initiative itself is too far, but we're pro-life, and so we're going to re-elect this fellow, Rounds, his name is. And then meanwhile, across the country, the new Democratic governor of Colorado is pro-life. Heath Shuler, the sort of quarterback of some renown, is from North Carolina, is pro-life.
And of course, Casey and beating Santorum.
Right, exactly. The incoming Senator Casey of Pennsylvania. So I think that's the. Now, the point I'm getting at, though, is, and I think on the Reagan Democrats is, and you're not quite cooperating because you're agreeing with me too much here, is, which is not to say that I'm right and you're wrong. I mean, we're both right. We both were right, obviously, before we started this conversation, is that the Beltway has a hard time dealing with this.
I agree, and that's why I think the interpretation that some people are putting on it that that only conservative Democrats won. It's not that simple. In fact, the Progressive Caucus in the House, if you want to just count the numbers, is going up. The Progressive Democrats is going up in numbers, and it has far more, more people than the Blue Dogs and anybody else. So, I mean, there are a lot of different things happening here, and I think it just shows that the voters, you can reach voters on a lot of different levels and on different issues, depending what's happening in the broader reality.
Right.
And right now, it was, in Iraq, trumped gay marriage. In a lot of ways, for many, what you might call Republican swing voters, and even some Republican-based voters who got peeled away. Not too many, but a few did. Vote unlike you and I. We think in linear ideological terms, sometimes in policy terms. Although we each try to, I think, be free thinkers to an extent. People who don't deal with this day in day out, who aren't blogging every day, don't work at think tanks. Their political decision making is a lot more either intuitive, up for change, up for grabs is a nice way of putting it, and they're not. Their buttons can't always be pushed as automatically as I think
the political tacticians back here believe.
Right, but here's my punchline on this argument, and that is that traditionally the Reagan Democrats, swing voters, white middle class, Northern Catholics, however you want to define them, have seen their votes be interpreted by the respective parties in ways that they don't necessarily agree with. When the Republicans win, they say, obviously this is a mandate for a flat tax. Yeah. And the partial privatization of Social Security, and who knows what else, the transformation of the Middle East. When the Democrats get elected, they say this is obviously a mandate to block right-wing judges and to move forward on affirmative action, and the ACLU, and repeal the Patriot Act, and so on. And I think both parties have done a pretty good job of purposefully misapprehending what the Reagan Democrats want, because it serves their own respective purposes ideologically here in Washington and in New York and so on and so on.
Yeah, it's just really spin is what it is.
But I'm saying we're about to have 4 tests of whether the kind of globalist consensus that has prevailed in America in the last 60 years is still valid. I think the point is, since World War II, since the end of the Cold War, both the right and the left have pretty much, not everybody obviously, but for the most part, agreed that America should have a substantial, large, ambitious role in the world on 4 issues: on trade, on immigration, on foreign military intervention, and increasingly on international environmentalism, the Kyoto Treaty. And I think so. For the last 60 years, the elites have said whoever won the election doesn't really matter, because we're going to move forward on trade, we're going to move forward on American military power, we're going to move forward on opening up immigration, and increasingly we're going to move forward on international environmentalism. And my argument, which I think I'll publish pretty quick if I can make sense articulating it here, is that this is going to change. That the experience of the Iraq War has sort of put a kind of a cap on American military puissance, if you will. That the backlash against immigration has changed that debate pretty decisively. That the victory of people like Sherrod Brown, the Democrat who just got elected to the Senate seat in Ohio, and the future backlash against things like the Kyoto Treaty. I see in the New York Times this morning that incoming Environment and Public Works Chairman Barbara Boxer has said that her first priority, as she takes over from Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, probably the biggest ideological shift in the Senate I can think of, between Inhofe of Oklahoma to Boxer of California.
Well, Inhofe actually believes that global warming is just a conspiracy, put together by crazy environmentalists. There's nothing to worry about.
As I said, biggest ideological shift probably of any committee chairmanship, Inhofe to Boxer. Now, however, I think now the challenge is to see whether or not the consensus on trade, the consensus on foreign wars, the consensus on immigration, and the consensus on, at least among the elites, on environmentalism can withstand the politics of the next 2 or 4 or 6 years. What say you?
It's always been interesting to me that when you look at some of these issues, and trade is probably the best example. You've seen several examples in the past of when a right type of populism and a left type of populism have melded together against the elites. The good example was Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot, and Ralph Nader joining against NAFTA, which was supported by the Clinton administration and most of the Republican leaders in town as well. And I think that I think it may actually be a good thing, if not at least an interesting thing, that in the next couple of years, some of these ideological shifts may spread to these other issues that you're talking about, and they may not fall neatly into the D and R categories that we have, or liberal and conservative, and you will create a whole new set of dynamics, and may make life a lot harder for the party leaders, because we'll still probably continue to have a binary political system with the Republicans and Democrats trading blows, but being able to perhaps do so less coherently on some of these issues, as their own caucuses divide along some of these lines, which are more ideological and issue-oriented than partisan.
Right, which again, I think one test, we already talked about Iraq, I think a second big test coming soon will be immigration.
I'll get a shot in here first, and then I'll let you go. Looking at this last election, I'm still not. I know that there are. There's a hardcore. Whether it's 15% or so of the public that seems to be obsessed with immigration. And many of them see it as from a cultural perspective, and some might see it even from a bigoted perspective. Some might try to say it's a security issue. But I actually months ago thought that the Republicans could save their position in Congress by beating the immigration drum louder and harder and turning out those people and making the illegal immigrant sort of the bogeyman of this election. I didn't see that happen. Looking at some of the exit polling data, I'm still not convinced that Americans, by and large, are as worried and scared about illegal immigration as some of the talk show hosts and some of the more obsessive folks in Congress believe they are, perhaps as even you do.
Well, okay, fair enough. We'll have another election to sort of help sort this out. Do you think that a guest worker program is a good idea?
I'm kind of divided on that, and because I do think there's a problem in terms of the impact it has on wages. To me, my larger concern is what to do with the people who are here now, who aren't going back, and having an underground economy. For all various reasons, I think an underground portion of the society is a bad thing. And so what drives my immigration concern is having a package that will allow the integration of those people into our society and our economy so we, get the benefits and minimize the cost.
You didn't quite answer the question.
No, because I told you that I am divided on the notion of a guest worker program.
But remember,
I tend to not like the idea of a two-tier labor system in this country when some workers get certain rights and other workers get other rights.
I agree. I agree. That's my point. I think it is profound.
But hey, I'm trying to be as practical as everybody else now in this new era of bipartisanship. And so I'm not, writing anything off the table. But I don't want the guest worker program to become an excuse for companies to get away with not giving benefits and paying low wages and putting pressure on people who are not guest workers.
Right. And what do you do when if a guest worker gets married or gets in legal trouble or something? I mean, you have a million issues that I think that have been swept under the rug, discussion-wise.
Right.
It's one thing to say, look, there are 10 million illegal, or 12 million, or whatever the number is, illegal people here, and what do we do with them? That's one discussion. But I think what the American people haven't really come to grips with, and again, I agree, the 2006 election was, substantially about Iraq, which is why, Rumsfeld got fired as opposed to, the Secretary of Labor. But when people come to grips with the idea that the guest worker proposal is a new tranche of people coming in to, among other things, bid down wages, plus all the other issues including cultural issues and sort of national identity issues, I think that's going to be incredibly controversial, and I think it's a good example of where the 5 or 6 decade track record of the elites misinterpreting what the masses want on this issue is going to continue, quite possibly to some sort of rose garden ceremony later in 2007 that I think will generate a pretty substantial backlash when the people who don't pay attention very much, I agree, they're living their lives, finally figure out what happened to them.
I may be wrong on this, but I believe it's Byron Dorgan, the Democrat senator, who has been opposed to the guest worker program because of the labor price issues, and he's opposed people like Teddy Kennedy within his own party, who backs the McCain plan, which the president backed, which would lead to some form of guest worker program. And so as I say, I'm somewhat sympathetic to those arguments, and quite frankly need to look more into that. But let me use this to segue to perhaps might be our last segment here. And because I wrote the other day that I thought that Bush is going to have a me versus thee problem in the last 2 years of his presidency, and I think immigration is one issue here. And that is, already I see conservative Republicans in Washington and on the Hill saying our problem is that we weren't conservative enough, and we have to sharpen our edges and differentiate ourselves even more so from the Democrats on the Hill, so that there's a clear choice in 2008, and we can regain the majority in both the House and Senate. And they, of course, would be happy to have the president leading that charge. The president, to me, seems to have a different agenda. He can't be reelected, obviously, and his legacy at this point is really only about one thing: Iraq. And Iraq, as he's admitted, may not change much in the next 2 years, despite all the talk about the Baker Commission and what Democrats in Congress may or may not want to do. And the only way he might be able to sort of add or keep his legacy from being just about Iraq would be to come up with some legislative accomplishments. How do you do that? You don't sharpen your edges against the Democrats, you work with the Democrats. Immigration being perhaps one of the few issues that immediately come to mind where he is, close to the same page with some of the Democratic leadership, and you have some Republicans like John McCain who are, who are there as well. So you're going to see, I think, continuously over the next 2 years, a possible rift, and at least a pretty strong strain of tension between the conservatives on the Hill who want to just, set up the next election, and a White House and a president who knows he has to do something, get something done other than Iraq. And immigration may be the first to-do item on that list for the president.
I think that's a good point. I agree. I think it's also an issue that's near and dear to Bush. I think he clearly has the classic Texas landowner position on imported labor, which is he's all for it, in great numbers. So, and I think after that, you do have a hard time finding too many more issues. I mean, you can always think of something on, no child left. You can dream up something on education. You can dream up something on health care. Admittedly, not probably major.
I mean, the sleeper issue might be for the White House here, the alternative minimum tax. That does seem to be the tax cut that Democrats are most interested in now. If you don't know what it is, don't ask me to explain. All I know is that I'm worried about it. It would be a shift in, only a quasi shift in the White House part to focus in on that as opposed to extending the existing tax cuts and other things. But I wouldn't
I'll
put
give
it
you two more issues like that. One that have the potential there. One is energy. Mm-hmm. The president said that we were addicted to oil, and we still are a year later. And so what are we going to do about that? Another issue, curiously enough, is I think the estate tax. I think there is a lot of support in the country for in terms of family farms and small businesses in terms of some dealing with the so-called debt tax, which has been sort of winding down and then bizarrely kicks back up to its original.
Well, the family farm thing is a total canard.
Well, okay.
I don't want people to. You can come up with whatever reasons you want for. Getting rid of the estate tax, but you just can't hang it on the family farm.
Well, tell that to Senator Pryor, Democrat of Arkansas.
I'll tell it to you. The New York Times did a great story when the White House first came out and started talking about getting rid of the estate tax. This back in 2001. To save the family farm, they went to the American Farm Bureau and said, "Give me one example of a family farm that's been lost due to the estate tax," and they couldn't come up with one. Not a single one in this great land of ours.
I just had a conversation with Thomas Ravenel, who was just elected to be the treasurer of the state of South Carolina on Tuesday. He beat an 8-term Democratic incumbent, and he told me that a friend of his has a 200-acre parcel of land in the family, and they're going to have to sell it. And so he.
I've been told anybody with a decent accountant who does any estate planning and buys the right life insurance plan. Doesn't have a problem.
Well, okay. Any blogger who wants to go to Ravenel2006.org. I expect you'll eventually track him down. And he has an example. So there's one that I just heard last night. Okay. I think the point though is that the total repeal of the death tax, the inheritance tax, got 57 votes in the Senate. That's more than our Republicans in the Senate. A bunch of Democrats voted for it, and it lost. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say it happened. It was defeated on a cloture vote. They needed 60 to overcome it. But I think you'll see strange coalitions emerging as all these Democrats who took over Republican seats in farm states and in red states all of a sudden discover that they have to now deliver for basically the same constituencies that elected the Republicans for the last 20 or 30 years, typically. They're now their constituents, and so you'll see an emergence of a moderate conservative Democratic group, Blue Dogs or whatever you want to call them.
Listen, I think the dynamics are going to be shifting, and I think they're going to be shifting on the Republican side too, on the war in particular. People are going to, Republicans, if this problem isn't solved, are going to feel more vulnerable on that going into 2008, and the presidential election is going to confuse things even further, particularly if you have John McCain 2 years from now calling for putting more troops in as he does today. So listen, as a pundit, as a reporter, I have to say I'm looking forward to all this. Anything that that stirs the pot, creates for better conversations. I'm glad finally you and I could disagree on something with the state tax, and I think the one thing that a lot of us agree on is that politics in Washington have become very stifled and dominated by stereotypes and talking points. And if you juice things up a little, maybe it will engage the public a wee bit more, which for a small R Republican and a small D Democrat, that's not a bad thing.
Turnout was up this year. That was a good thing.
Okay, so let's end on that good news.
Okay, thank you, David.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.